when you genuinely ask yourself that question, it's like it all becomes clear.
I got a glitch.
Hello beautiful people and welcome back. It's Ash, your truth-bombing fairy godmother for everything love, dating, and relationships. Today's video is going to be applicable to all kinds of situations and certainly isn't only relevant to romantic relationships, and that is the topic of forgiveness. Specifically, how to forgive and let go when someone, whether that person is an ex or a friend or a family member or anyone else, has really caused harm and hurt you. I've done a video on self-forgiveness before, but I thought now might be a good time to revisit the topic of forgiving others, especially when we haven't been offered an apology or acknowledgement or closure. But before we get into it, don't forget to consider subscribing to my channel for new love, dating, and relationship videos every single week. And of course, if you find today's video at all helpful, please feel free to give it a thumbs up below. Today's video is inspired by one of my absolute favorites, and that is Tara Brach, who I reference on this channel quite a bit. And a few years back, she did a 1-hour talk on forgiveness, and the whole thing is on YouTube, so I will of course link it in the description box down below. But if you're interested in a much better, more in-depth version of this video, please go check out Tara Brach's. I highly, highly suggest giving it a watch. But everything I'm going to be referencing and discussing in this video is firstly mentioned by Tara Brach in hers. In her video, she describes the definition of forgiveness as the act of letting go of the armor of our stories of blame. When people behave in ways that we don't agree with, or things don't happen the way that we wanted them to, it is a really natural and often instinctual response to look for something or someone to blame. When something is painful or upsetting, we naturally look for a cause so that we can control it. So we create these stories or certain narratives about a person or about their act of betrayal as a way to feel more in control. So to forgive would mean to let go of our stories or the armor that those stories provides. And to be clear, when I say stories, it doesn't mean that your perception was incorrect or that this person didn't in fact do something extremely harmful, but it just refers to that rumination that happens where we replay a situation in our heads over and over again, and then we develop certain ideas and judgments about a person and how they could do what they did and what kind of person they are, or anything else that isn't explicit fact, but rather our own interpretations or attempts to make sense of a situation. And letting go of these stories of blame is really hard. Forgiveness is something that we are really afraid to do. Tara shares that when she runs some of these workshops, she'll often ask participants, what is between you and forgiveness? Or what would happen if you were to forgive? Or what would be so bad about it? And the answer is very often fear. A fear of being taken advantage of allowing something to happen again, of condoning the behavior. And I know for me personally, fear has without a doubt been the biggest roadblock that I've faced when it comes to me and forgiveness. If I peel back the layers and get really honest about the stories I've often told myself, there is a deep rooted fear that if I soften my reaction or let go of blame or bring compassion to a person who has wronged me or someone else, that I am not only sending the message to myself and this other person that what they did was okay, but that I am making myself more vulnerable to a similar situation reoccurring. And because this fear is so prevalent amongst those of us who are holding on to blame and anger and resentment, understanding what forgiveness actually entails is really important. Because as Tara puts it, forgiveness is not condoning behavior. And in fact, learning to or continuing to set very clear boundaries of what you will or won't accept is a really relevant part of forgiveness. But what we are doing when we are forgiving, and I quote, is refusing to continue to allow our hearts to tighten up into a knot of anger and aversion. And she goes on to say something that is so incredibly misunderstood about forgiveness, which is that we can forgive, but we can also vow never again. We can forgive and decide to never spend time with someone again. We can forgive and also recognize that we were treated in a way that we will never again tolerate or accept. We can forgive and protest certain injustices. We can forgive and press charges against someone who has violated us. We can do absolutely anything that we need to do to honor ourselves in a loving, protective way, while also choosing to release that hardness and armoring. And for me, rewatching Tara's video right now and just being reminded of that, especially with just all the toxicity and injustices in the world, was so timely and powerful. And that I can forgive and that I don't need to grip onto that armoring so tightly to the point that I make myself feel just resentful and miserable and sick, really, while also continuing to fight against certain injustices or use my voice in ways that I feel doing so is needed. And another point I want to mention here is that forgiveness does not need to be an immediate goal. Feeling anger and allowing it to exist and move through us is vital. Forgiving and letting go isn't about floating around like some mystical, peaceful monk who never feels pissed off. And Tara reminds us in her video that feeling anger and allowing it to come up is extremely healthy and normal, because anger lets us know that paying attention to something is important and deserves our care. But when we become completely stuck in that anger for months or years or even decades, that's when it becomes poisonous. Because when we operate from a place of perpetual anger and resentment, we end up perceiving the world through a very small lens. But again, attempting to skip over or bypass that anger can be just as harmful, because doing so would not honor the truth of our emotional experience. And there's a quote that I read recently that said, "Forgiveness can only happen at the end of an emotional journey, not at the beginning. So you need to get angry about what happened to you and to grieve over the fact that you never had what you needed, you never had what you longed for. Never diminish or deny the damage done to you." And I don't necessarily believe that there is a literal end to an emotional journey, but the point being here is that feeling anger and allowing yourself to grieve what you feel was taken from you or the ways in which you feel you were wronged is extremely important. But it's when that anger and that inability to let go of that armor begins to define us that it becomes problematic. And in my experience, and I know in so many other people's experiences as well, in addition to that fear that I discussed earlier, what often keeps us stuck and holding on to that anger is feeling as though the person who has hurt us has not successfully acknowledged their wrongdoing or our pain. And as wonderful as it would be if that could happen, if that's what you're waiting for in order to be able to move on, you will very likely be waiting a lifetime. Forgiveness is very often a solo experience. And truly accepting and coming to terms with that reality is a key element to being able to forgive. You have to let go of the expectation that someone else is in charge of your emotional journey, or that someone else is in charge of the way in which you show up in the world. It is up to you, not up to this other person who, quite frankly, could probably care less about what you do or don't do to initiate your own healing. And when it comes to learning how to heal, or in this case, learning how to let go of our stories of blame and judgment and resentment, Tara asks a question in her video that is just so sobering and powerful, which is, in the face of reality, which is, I'm going to die, we're all going to die, If you knew you were on your deathbed, would you hold on to that resentment? And when you genuinely ask yourself that question, it's like it all becomes clear. We know from our deepest, wisest, most loving parts of ourselves that holding on to that anger and resentment is not who we are. And that right there, the ability to truly recognize that we are so much bigger than the stories of blame and so much more than this small, closed off existence of operating from this hardened, resentful place is where the path to healing, letting go, and forgiving begins. That is where the ability to become more conscious about our stories of blame lives. And to summarize what Tara says this process actually looks like in the moments when anger and resentment just has its grip on you, is to firstly start by bringing awareness to whatever it is that you're believing, such as this person is bad for doing what they did. And then to feel underneath that, to the part of you that's been wounded. Because unless you get underneath that story of blame, it's impossible to forgive unless you can bring awareness and compassion to the part of you that's hurting. And when I think back to my own, some very recent situations where I've felt anger due to feeling betrayed, when I get underneath the story about how bad that person is or was, I can really sense those wounded parts of myself that felt as though I was made to look like a fool, or that I was unlikable or unlovable, or that I wasn't worthy in some way, or that I wasn't enough, or that I was powerless. And for situations in which we've been holding on to blame and anger and resentment for a very long time, we often have to choose to get underneath those stories over and over and over again, and instead offer ourselves that kindness and compassion and empathy. And very gradually over time, we will often feel more ready and willing to include that person who has hurt us and wronged us in that offering of compassion and understanding as well. Once again, guys, I highly recommend that you watch Tara Brach's video on this topic if anything of what I've said in this video has resonated with you. But for the sake of not making this video an hour long as well, I just kind of wanted to give you a little Cliff Notes version, and of course some of my own interpretations of her teachings as well. But as always, I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this, because I know that forgiveness is something that people have a variety of different perspectives on. So please feel free to share in the comment section down below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next week.
Tell me what was in that stuff you gave me. I think I like it. In fact, it made me high.